Hello, could you tell me your name and where you're from?
Steve Meacham, and I work at City Life Vita Urbana in Boston, Massachusetts. City Life was actually formed at about the time that I decided to become a community organizer, although I wasn't affiliated with them at that time. But they were really founded by a bunch of activists who had come out of the anti-war movement and black liberation and feminist movements. And they decided we want to take these kind of radical politics and implement them in a local working class neighborhood, which turned out to be Jamaica Plain in Boston. So that was City Life's origin. Actually, when City Life formed, just a couple of years prior, mass movements had defeated some of the interstate plans that would have run highways through the heart of Boston. But they didn't defeat them before there was this mass destruction of property, and there was kind of a vacant swath of land, which was called the I-95 corridor through Boston. And that went right through Jamaica Plain. So there was a lot of disinvestment in boarded up buildings and troubles that resulted from that, as well as a continuing white flight to the suburbs, a growing desegregation movement, a growing proportion of Latinos in Jamaica Plain. So City Life entered into that, and a lot of that had to do with land and housing. And so it was a priority from the beginning.
And what happened in 2008? The City Life got involved in the foreclosure crisis.
Well, in the early, what do they call it? The early noughts from like 2000 to 2007,
right.
We had a robust collective bargaining campaign for tenants. So we were out organizing buildings of people who were getting big rent increases and mass evictions from corporate landlords. And we were organizing them like you would a group of workers in a workplace to organize a union and demand a collective bargaining agreement. And whereas, in a union you're demanding a 3-year contract, let's say, that says what the wage will be and says some of the conditions of work, we were demanding a 3-year contract that limited rent increases and affected the conditions of the home. So we were doing that up till about 2007 intensely, and we had over 1,000 units under contract. But in 2007, we discovered that the biggest evicting entity in housing court in Boston was Deutsche Bank. And that 5 of the 10 biggest evicting entities were all banks. And we kind of said, wow, this is a new scene here, and this is something we can do about it. We don't really do loan modification. We're not skilled in that, but we know how to stop evictions because we're tenant organizers. So we started reaching out to the victims of foreclosure, both tenants and owners living in foreclosed buildings, and organizing eviction defense post-foreclosure. And that turned out to be really beyond our expectations even, a very huge source of leverage to get the banks to deal. The foreclosure crisis kind of introduced a new element into a historic housing justice movement. And that housing justice movement historically had 2 parts to it. One was, what do you do in an urban neighborhood where the main problem is disinvestment? Boarded up buildings and trash-strewn vacant lots and all that kind of stuff. In other words, and falling property values. What do you do there? And what do you do in neighborhoods where people have really turned around those bad things, and now there's money flowing in, but people are being driven out, gentrifying neighborhoods? And so in some ways, there's a whole set of tactics and strategies for one and a whole set for the other. And, you've got, and sometimes they're in the same area, in the same metropolitan area, and sometimes they're in the same neighborhood at different moments in time. And in fact, City Life has had, through its 40-year history, has gone through cycles of booms and busts of responding to the changing nature of the housing crisis from when the market was in a bust and when it was in a boom. And it's a kind of a sign that you really have to be nimble as organizers in looking at what the objective conditions are and responding to them correctly. But I think it's true that all across the country, people are responding to one or the other of these crises. And the foreclosure crisis was just a kind of a new wrinkle for most of us that became a very profound wrinkle, but was just integrated into those other 2 things.
Right.
One thing that the defenders of the real estate industry, that their kind of flacks say to us is, you're full of it. You're always saying there's a real estate crisis. There can't always be a real estate crisis. And we respond, well, yeah, there is always a real estate crisis, because in some ways it's not the problem of the real estate market directly. It's a problem of that gap, that income wealth gap. The bigger that becomes, the bigger swath of people on the bottom who simply can't afford to buy housing because they're relatively impoverished.
Right.
And so there is a permanent real estate crisis of one kind or the other that is following directly on the heels of that income and wealth gap.
Right. And what would you say to the, layman in this country who, when you say something like, housing needs to be decommodified, and he is struck with terror at the thought that someone's going to come and take his house that he owns, that is his property. What do you say to that person who has that perception of what you just said, let's decommodify housing?
Well, that's a really important question, I think. And it gets to the fact that we make this really broad distinction between ownership for profit or investment and ownership for use. And this is also a historic distinction. Production for use, production for exchange. This is an old Marxist, analysis. But in housing, somebody who lives in what we call in Boston a triple decker or a 3-family house and pays a price for that house and tries to adjust the rents in such a way to make the mortgage work, that house is partly an investment, and those are partly the owner's tenants, but mainly that is their home. And those tenants are their neighbors. And their interaction with those tenants is primarily has to do with noise and individual respect and all kinds of stuff that have nothing to do with economics.
Right.
And it really is a completely different dynamic than owning a building for profit. And in many ways, it's similar to the difference between an owner who owns a corner store and works there versus a capitalist. That it's a different dynamic, a different experience, a different consciousness that emerges from that. And we, at our peril, allow the real estate industry to link all owners together. And there is another whole mythology out there that says, well, all ownership is the same. The thing that, because after all, ownership isn't something that comes from some divine cosmic interpretation. It's simply a set of laws that defines your relationship with the thing, But there is a mythology that says that my relationship to my shirt is the same as my relationship to my 1,000 apartments that I own in Boston. Both are ownership entities, and therefore you can't tell me what to do with my shirt. I won't tell you what to do with your shirt if you don't tell me what to do with my 1,000 units. That's the mythology.
Right.
And our job is to say all ownership is not the same.
Right.
And there are different requirements and restrictions on ownership depending on how much my ownership affects other people, which is pretty obvious when you lay it out, but it's hidden behind the mythology of ownership. But we need to bring that out to say, look, it's residents in an area who have something in common, be they resident owners or resident tenants. It's residents in an area who pay real estate taxes. Absent the owners don't pay real estate taxes, they pass it on to their tenants. But resident owners and resident tenants do. So we are the ones that have to make common cause. And instinctively, many, many small owners get that. And tenants certainly get it. I mean, our tenant movements have said for years, if we want to win, we have to win over the small owners. Because whenever we go up to the city council, the state house for tenant protection legislation, the real estate industry snaps their fingers, sends out 40,000 letters tomorrow to every owner in Boston saying, if you let this happen, your taxes will go up. Make claims which are ridiculous, but we can't counter them. So we need to have a robust organizing presence among small owners, addressing their needs along with the tenants, and very consciously build that union. Many
SAFE members have credited City Life with being part of the formation of SAFE. And they like to say that we're based on the model of City Life. What is that model?
Well, we often call it the sword and the shield, but that's a shorthand for something much bigger, which it would take a bit of a length to explain. But the sword and the shield model is designed to link together individual casework that's really accountable and good. In other words, as we say in radical organizing, to handle the problem of the person walking through the door in a practical way that addresses their immediate needs. So that's kind of a casework focus and tends to be a legal focus sometimes, tends to be a focus that our legal allies take up. But that's the shield. But then the sword is public protest, public pressure, movement building. And the sword links cases together into common campaigns against common enemies, whether they be individual banks or all the banks or individual corporate landlords or all the corporate landlords, and tries to make common demands instead of just saying, let's take this case by case, let's make a common demand that will resolve all the cases. Let's adopt tactics and strategies in an individual case that will affect all the cases. And so that's a more of a movement building approach. So the sword and the shield strategy was an understanding that we needed to do both of those things at the same time. That there was no way to organize people who are directly affected by a crisis like foreclosure or displacement and not do casework, because otherwise you're asking people to join a movement at a moment of crisis in their life when they don't have the capacity to do that, or most people would not. And that's true of even our strongest organizers today. Our most well-known, photogenic, outspoken organizers were not that way when they came to us. They were silent and, and wanting to stay in the shadows, so to speak. And it takes a while for people to process their individual case, to get help in their individual case enough to say, okay, I get it, I'm coming out now,
Right.
And so we think that it really, the sword and the shield kind of encompasses that duality. It also projects an understanding that this is a question of raw power, and that stopping displacement, cannot be an appeal to the morality of, housing is a human right. We say that too, and we believe it, and it informs our work. But you can't, you can't appeal to the morality of the other side. They don't really give a damn, But you can appeal to their bottom line. You can disrupt the functioning of their business enough that their business costs rise and that they're forced to deal with you. And so the sword and the shield, is a somewhat militaristic, intent to produce an idea. This is a real fight, and you need to get prepared for the fight. And to be in the fight means you need a sword and a shield, because they're going to get you if you don't have both. So that's why we describe it that way. And then there's a lot of kind of methodologies that flow from that, like something we call the 5 masses.
Okay, which is?
The 5 masses are mass outreach, mass meetings, mass casework, mass actions, and mass political education. And so they describe the methodology of building an organization like SAFE or City Life or the Bank Tenant Association model, or even any tenant association really. But you need to reach the people, mass outreach. You need to have some aggressive way of going out there. And in the foreclosure crisis, one of the ways that we built our movement was that we visited every single home in the Boston metropolitan area, at least in the working class neighborhoods that were scheduled for foreclosure. And our main message was, don't move. And in terms of the mass meetings, we design meetings and have worked on designing meetings that are that inform people about their legal rights, and they plan actions. But like I was saying last night, there's a lot of rituals involved in those meetings that are overcoming shame and isolation. The mass casework is, as I described earlier, an attempt to have people understand that how we handle their case will be respectful of the individuality of their case, but will also be designed to build a much larger movement. Mass actions are our primary way of influencing the other side, mass actions of all kinds, from, relatively demure candlelight vigils to really aggressive eviction blockades and civil disobedience protests at the courthouse and things like that. And then mass political education is our understanding that everybody needs to understand the way the system is put together. There's no way to fight bank outrages or gentrification, displacement outrages without having a radical analysis of how the system works. We need to teach that, because you don't get it anywhere else but from the movement. There's, most colleges don't teach that. So we have to teach it.
Thank you. Excellent answers. Really enjoyed it.